I wasn't even supposed to go to that party. It was one of those invite-only events, and the host? No one had a clue who he was. Some of my friends said it was one of those rich recluses, the kind who inherited some ancient mansion on the outskirts of town. You know the type, someone with too much money and too many secrets. We got the invite the day before, a weird email with no sender address, just a single line, "Come celebrate Halloween at the mansion. Be there by 8 p.m., don't be late." Attached was a map leading to a place none of us had ever been before. It sounded sketchy, but my friends were pumped, and I didn't want to be the one to chicken out. Put on my costume, and we all piled into my friend Mike's car. There were 5 of us in total. Me, Mike, Sarah, Jake, and his girlfriend, Lucy. The mansion was exactly what you'd expect from an old horror movie. Huge, gothic, and completely out of place. It was surrounded by thick woods, and the driveway was long and winding, almost as if it was designed to keep people out. But when we got there, the place was packed with cars. We walked up to the door, which was this massive oak thing, and as soon as we knocked, it creaked open on its own. Inside, the house was dimly lit with chandeliers, and everything had this old, antique vibe. There were already dozens of people inside, all dressed in elaborate costumes, laughing and drinking. At first, it seemed like your typical party. Loud music, drinks flowing, everyone having a good time. But there was something off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but the air felt heavy, like the walls were watching us. The host was nowhere to be seen, at least not at first. After about an hour, the lights flickered, and this guy appeared at the top of the grand staircase. He was tall, wearing a black mask that covered his whole face, and dressed in a suit that looked like it came from another century. He didn't say a word, just raised a glass and smiled. Or at least it felt like he smiled, though we couldn't see his face. The whole room got quiet, and then, without warning, the music picked back up, and everyone acted like nothing had happened. But from that point on, things started getting weird. The first thing I noticed was the rooms. It felt like the house was shifting. One minute, we'd be in the ballroom, and the next, we'd turn a corner and find ourselves in a hallway that hadn't been there before. At first, I thought maybe it was just the drinks messing with me, but then Sarah pulled me aside. "Does it feel like the house is changing to you?" she asked, her eyes wide with fear. I nodded, suddenly sober. We tried to find Mike and Jake, but they had wandered off, probably lost in the maze of rooms. Lucy had gone to the bathroom and hadn't come back. That's when I noticed people were disappearing. Not just my friends, random guests too. The more we looked, the more we realized that the crowd was thinning out, and no one seemed to care. No one except us. We decided to leave. Every door we tried was locked, and the windows wouldn't budge. The lights flickered again, and in the brief darkness, I swore I saw shadows moving on their own, darting across the walls. "We have to get out of here," Sarah whispered. We ran down another hallway, this one lined with portraits of people in old-fashioned clothes. I could have sworn their eyes were following us. We finally found a door that wasn't locked, but it led down to the basement. At that point, we didn't care. We just wanted out. The basement was even creepier than the rest of the house, filled with old furniture covered in sheets and strange markings on the walls. It felt wrong being down there, like we were intruding on something we shouldn't have seen. And then we found it. Tucked away in the corner of the basement was a dusty old chest, and like idiots, we opened it. Inside were costumes that looked exactly like the ones the other guests had been wearing. But these weren't new. They were ancient, rotting away, like they'd been there for decades. And underneath the costumes, bones, human bones. That's when we realized the truth. The party wasn't just a party. It was a trap. Every year the host lured in new guests, and every year those guests became part of the house. Trapped, forgotten, and slowly consumed by whatever haunted that place. We bolted back upstairs, but it was too late. The house had changed again, and no matter where we turned, we couldn't find a way out. The other guests, or whatever they were, started closing in on us, their eyes blank, their faces twisted into eerie smiles. They weren't people anymore. They were part of the mansion, and soon, we would be too. I don't know how, but Sarah and I managed to escape, barely. We found a window that hadn't been there before, and we jumped. I broke my leg in the fall, but I didn't care. We crawled away from that cursed place, leaving behind Mike, Jake, Lucy, and whoever else had been unlucky enough to show up that night. I never saw them again. It all started about a week before Halloween. I was in a tight spot. My car broke down, and I needed something cheap and quick to get me to work. I didn't have the money for anything fancy, so I went to this small dealership on the outskirts of town. It was one of those places that you drive by and never think twice about. You know, old cars lined up in the dirt, the kind of place you avoid unless you're desperate. And I was desperate. The guy running the place looked like he belonged in a horror movie. He was short, greasy hair, and had this weird smile plastered on his face the entire time. I should have trusted my gut and left, but I was stressed. He showed me a car, a beat-up old sedan that looked like it had seen better days. But it ran, and that's all I cared about. Plus, it was dirt cheap. The guy didn't even give me any paperwork, just handed me the keys and waved me off. I thought it was sketchy, but honestly, I didn't care. The first couple of days, nothing weird happened. The car was fine, ugly as hell, but it got me from point A to point B. Then, one night, as I was driving home from a late shift, the radio clicked on all by itself. Now I hadn't even touched the thing since I bought the car. It was an old crappy radio that barely worked, so I usually kept it off. But out of nowhere it turned on, blasting static. I nearly jumped out of my seat. I fiddled with the dial, but it was stuck on this one station, playing some staticky, old-timey song. I didn't recognize it, but it sounded like something from the 50s. I figured it was just a glitch and turned the radio off. But then it happened again the next night, around the same time too. Same static, same weird old song. That's when I started to get freaked out. Each night, the radio would turn on at exactly 11:30 p.m., like clockwork. And it wasn't just the static anymore. There was something else. I started hearing this faint voice under the static, like it was whispering. At first, I couldn't make out what it was saying, but it got louder every night. By the third night, I could swear it was saying my name. By then, I was totally freaked out. I tried telling myself it was just my imagination, but it didn't feel like that. It felt real. Too real. One night, after the radio clicked on again, the voice was clearer than ever. It wasn't just whispering my name anymore. It was telling me things. Things about me. Stuff no one should know. It talked about my childhood, about the time I got lost in the woods when I was 7. It mentioned how I used to be afraid of the dark, how I cried every night for a week when my dog died. It knew things no one else did, things I hadn't even told my closest friends. I tried shutting the radio off, but it wouldn't stop. The voice kept going, getting louder and more demanding. Then it started giving me directions. It told me to drive down roads I didn't recognize, roads that didn't even show up on my GPS. I didn't follow them, of course. I wasn't that stupid. But the voice, it got angry. It started saying I had to follow, that I didn't have a choice. That's when I knew I had to get rid of the car. I went back to the dealership the next day, ready to demand my money back, or at least dump the car there and never look back. But when I got there, the place was gone. I mean, the whole dealership was just gone, like it had never been there. I drove up and down that stretch of road thinking maybe I'd gone to the wrong spot, but there was nothing there, just an empty lot. I was losing it at this point. I even went to the local DMV to check the registration, but they had no record of the car. According to their system, the car didn't exist. I didn't know what to do, so I went online and started digging. That's when I found something even more terrifying. I stumbled across an old news article from 10 years ago. It was about a young woman who had gone missing, and the last place she'd been seen was driving a car just like mine. The article didn't have much detail, but it said she'd been heading down an isolated stretch of highway late at night, right before Halloween. Her car was found abandoned on the side of the road a week later, but she was never found. It was the same make and model as the car I'd bought. Same color, same everything. I felt sick. I knew I had to get rid of it, but I didn't know how. I thought about junking it, but something told me that wouldn't work. It was like the car had some kind of hold on me. Every time I tried to get rid of it, something would go wrong. The engine wouldn't start, or I'd get a flat tire, or I'd get this overwhelming sense of dread that would make me stop. Then, last night, the voice on the radio got louder than ever. It wasn't just whispering anymore. It was shouting, screaming at me to drive. It gave me directions again, and this time I couldn't resist. It was like my body was moving on its own. I started driving, heading down roads I'd never seen before. The radio kept blaring, that same old song playing in the background, the voice shouting over it. I don't know how long I drove for, but eventually I ended up on this empty, isolated stretch of highway. The streetlights were flickering, and the air felt thick, like something was pressing down on me. Then the voice said, "Stop." I slammed on the brakes without even thinking. The road ahead was dark, and I couldn't see anything beyond the headlights. That's when I saw her. standing in the middle of the road, just staring at me. She was pale, almost glowing in the darkness, and her eyes, they were hollow, empty. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. I just sat there, frozen, as she slowly walked toward the car. The radio was still playing, but the voice had gone silent. I don't remember what happened next. All I know is that I woke up in my driveway this morning with no memory of how I got there. The car was still running, and the radio was off. But the worst part? There were muddy footprints leading away from the car like someone or something had been there. I haven't driven the car since. It's still sitting outside waiting for me, but I can't bring myself to go near it. I don't know what's going to happen next, but I'm terrified to find out. If you ever come across a deal that seems too good to be true, especially around Halloween, trust your instincts. Some things are better left alone. I've been debating whether to share this, but I need to get it off my chest. Maybe it'll help someone else avoid the same thing. It was our first Halloween in a new neighborhood. My wife Sarah and I had just moved in with our 2 kids, Tyler and Emma, and we were excited. It was a nice, quiet suburban area, full of families. The kind of place where everyone decorates their houses with cobwebs, pumpkins, and plastic skeletons. You know the vibe. Safe, friendly, perfect for kids. We spent the whole afternoon setting up decorations. Sarah hung fake bats from the porch, and Tyler and Emma carved these huge jack-o'-lanterns that we lit up right before the sun went down. Everything seemed perfect. We were excited to hand out candy and meet our new neighbors. The night started off normal enough. We had a steady stream of trick-or-treaters, kids in cute costumes, parents smiling from the sidewalk, the usual. By 9 p.m., things were winding down, and we were getting ready to call it a night. I was about to turn off the porch light when the doorbell rang. I opened the door, expecting one last group of kids, but there was just one. It was a small kid, maybe 8 or 9, standing alone on our porch. They were wearing this old beat-up costume that I couldn't quite place. It looked like one of those vintage outfits, kind of ragged, like it'd been through the wash a few too many times. The mask was one of those old plastic ones with the elastic band, but I couldn't make out much of the face behind it. The kid didn't say a word, just stood there holding out a worn-out pillowcase. I smiled, dropped a couple of pieces of candy in the bag, and waited for a thank you or something. But the kid just turned and walked away without a word. It was weird, but I didn't think too much of it. Halloween brings out all kinds of kids. About 15 minutes later, we were cleaning up when the doorbell rang again. I figured maybe we had missed some kids from before. I opened the door, and there they were, the same kid in the same ratty costume, just standing there, silent, holding out the same pillowcase. I laughed awkwardly, thinking it was a joke, or maybe they just wanted more candy. I dropped another couple of pieces in the bag and watched as they walked away again. No words. No thank you. Nothing. Sarah noticed I was acting weird when I came back inside. I told her about the kid, probably just some kid messing with you, she said. It's Halloween after all. The kid's behavior was just strange. An hour later, we were settling in for the night. The kids were asleep, and Sarah and I were watching some horror movie on TV. The doorbell rang again. This time, I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't want to answer it, but I knew I had to. I opened the door and there was the kid again. Same costume, same pillowcase, but something was different this time. The air felt heavier, colder. I don't know how to explain it, but it felt like the temperature had dropped 10 degrees. I looked at the kid. "I'm sorry, buddy," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We're out of candy." The kid didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, holding out the bag. I felt this deep, unsettling fear starting to build in my stomach. Something about this kid wasn't right. It wasn't normal. I closed the door. I know that sounds rude, but I didn't know what else to do. I stood there for a minute, my hand still on the doorknob, listening. No footsteps, no sound at all. I peeked out the window, but the kid was gone. I told Sarah about it, and she finally started to look concerned. She suggested maybe we call the neighbors in the morning, ask if they saw the same kid. The next morning, I went around and asked a few of our neighbors if they'd had any late trick-or-treaters. Most of them said no, that they'd turned off their lights by 9:30 or so. But then I asked the old couple that lived 2 doors down. The moment I mentioned the kid in the old costume, their faces went pale. The wife grabbed her husband's arm, and they exchanged this look that made my skin crawl. "You saw him, didn't you?" she whispered. Her voice was shaky, like she was afraid of the answer. I nodded, and the husband sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. He looked tired, Every year, someone new in the neighborhood gets a visit, he said quietly. It's been happening for as long as we've lived here. I was stunned. What do you mean? What's going on? The wife looked at me, her eyes wide with fear. Years ago, a little boy went missing on Halloween night. He was trick-or-treating alone, and he never came home. They searched for him for weeks, but they never found him. The thing is, the husband added, every Halloween since then, someone new in the neighborhood gets a visit from a kid matching his description. Always late at night, always wearing that same old costume. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. But who is it? What does he want? The wife shook her head. No one knows. People have tried to follow him, but he always disappears. All we know is that once you see him, he comes back every year. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept looking out the window, half expecting to see the kid standing in our yard, waiting. But the street was empty. We didn't get another visit that Halloween, but now I'm dreading next year. I don't know what he is, or what he wants, but something tells me this isn't over. If you ever move to a new neighborhood around Halloween, keep an eye out. And if you see a lone trick-or-treater in an old, tattered costume, don't answer the door.